Wondered why that pilot voice is so common? You know, the pilot voice, the deep, friendly sounding, calm voice that we hear all the pilots speak. They get on the radio and, folks, this is your pilot speaking. We're going to be running into a little turbulence here soon. Things might get a little bit choppy. You could all just fasten your seatbelt and enjoy the rest of your flight. Right? We've all heard the voice. Now that voice might sound southern or southwestern in origin, but it's not. It's specifically Appalachian in origin, and more specifically, a mountain town in West Virginia. That pilot voice that we're all familiar with comes from one man. Now, I can tell you from personal experience with the fire department, sometimes I get stationed at the Fort Collins Loveland Airport, and every pilot out there, from the general aircraft, you know, the small prop planes, the Cessnas, the helicopters, the gliders, everybody out there, when they get on the radio, they speak in that pilot voice. How does this happen? How does everybody speak in this voice? Well, I'm going to tell you where this comes from. There was one man, and it was in the late 1940s, and he was a test pilot, one of the best that had ever been. Very calm, very confident, and just one of the best pilots that anyone had ever seen. This man was a fighter pilot in World War II, very successful, shot down many of the enemy planes. When he got back to the United States, the Air Force started testing jets and rocket planes. And before that, everything was propellers, was props. So this was a whole new region of the entire Air Force, you know, the entire airline industry of using jets now. And so he started off as a test pilot with them. And his instructors just marveled at how good he was, his skill set as a pilot. And not only that, though, his calmness and his presence, his confidence when he was on the radio. They were just amazed with this guy. This man's name was Chuck Yeager. And he was eventually selected to fly the X-1, which was a plane designed to break the sound barrier. The sound barrier. So let me... the sound barrier is named that, the sound barrier, for a reason. It's what it was actually thought of as a barrier, as nature's speed limit. 760 miles an hour, nothing will go faster than this. The reason that it was thought of as a barrier was that as planes started getting fast enough to approach those speeds, they would just start almost falling apart, buffeting like crazy. The controls would stop working or do opposite things of what they would normally do. And the physicists and engineers at the time thought that as something approached the speed of sound, the g-forces on it would become infinite, and it would tear apart anything more complicated than, say, like a bullet or something solid like that. So they thought any plane that would ever be made would be torn apart, and any pilot crazy enough to get in a plane would be torn apart. So the X-1 was a plane designed to test this. Is this the case? Can we make a plane fly faster than sound? So they developed this plane called the X-1, and it was actually built very much after a bullet. So it looked like a big bullet. It was a very, very small, tiny cockpit. The wings themselves were just tiny off the sides of it. They were 3 inches thick at the thickest part of the wings. It only carried enough fuel for 3 minutes of flight. The entire thing was just fuel with a small cockpit. Because it only had 3 minutes of power, it wasn't able to take off like a normal plane and get up to the speed it would need. So it would have to be carried by a larger plane, a bomber, be released up at the highest altitude of that bomber, and then it would climb into even higher altitude to get to that thin air, less air resistance, and maybe break that speed of sound. So this was the plane, the X-1. Chuck Yeager selected to fly it. And as you can imagine, this is the pinnacle of his entire industry, right? He wants this so bad. He's so excited to be this test pilot. And a couple days before the flight, he's out horseback riding. He falls off his horse, lands hard on his side, and his side is just killing him. It hurts. His side hurts. It hurts to take a deep breath. It hurts to really even move his right arm. And the next morning he wakes up And it's still the same. It hasn't gotten any better. And so Chuck Yeager is very reluctant to go to the base doctor, right? Because what's going to happen? They're either going to scrub the flight, or to him, worse yet, keep the flight going and put a different pilot in his place. He can't live with that. So he wants to go see a doctor. He drives a couple towns over, and he's still reluctant. He's thinking, this might get back to the base doctor if I go to see a doctor here. So he goes to a veterinarian. And he goes to this vet, gets checked out, and the vet tells him, Chuck, you've got 2 broken ribs. I can tape you up, but really you're just going to have to rest for about a month before this will get better. And he's not going to have any of that. So he knows that he can fly the plane. He can do everything in that flight and do it better than any pilot alive, with one problem. He can't latch the cockpit. So the plane itself, it's going to be sitting inside that bomber plane, and the cockpit, if you can imagine, the glass cockpit is going to be lowered down on a chain hoist, and to close it, to latch it, he has to really shove with his right arm. Again, very tight cockpit, so he can't maneuver to get into it any other way. Has to use his right arm, and it takes a heck of a shove to do it. And he thinks, well, maybe I can tough it out. So the morning of the flight arrives, and Chuck Yeager gets to the airfield. And if you can just picture this in your head, the plane, the X-1, is sitting out there on the airfield, and they're fueling it. And it runs off of alcohol and liquid oxygen. And liquid oxygen is regular oxygen, just super cooled to negative 300, where it becomes a liquid. So as they're fueling it, it's hitting the warm fuel tank, and it starts boiling off. And the plane itself is just sitting there, and it's just screaming, shrieking like a tea kettle, not even moving. Yeager comes up to the plane, climbs into the cockpit, and tries a couple test shoves. Tries that latching mechanism. The pain is excruciating. He knows he's not going to be able to do it. He can't do it. He can't latch the cockpit. So he goes over and he tells feels like he has to confide in somebody. He chooses the pilot of the bomber plane. And he goes over to him, tells him the whole story of what happened. And this pilot is also an engineer, and not for nothing, because he looks at the latch, knows Chuck's problem. He runs back to the hangar. He gets a stick of wood cuts off a broom handle about this big, and he says, Chuck, you're going to be able to wedge this into the latch, and you can use your left hand, and I think you'll be able to close it. So they don't say anything to anybody else. They get up into the plane. They're flying at the highest altitude of that bomber. And Chuck gets into the X-1, and he hooks up all of his lines and hoses, and they don't have helmets or anything, so he brought an old football helmet, a leather football helmet that he puts on, and they lower that glass canopy, and he puts the wooden lever in there, and flook, latches it. Everything's good. So that bomber releases it just like it would a bomb. The small X-1 comes out, and the rockets kick in. And Yeager gets slammed back into that seat. The G-forces are just tremendous. All that fuel is just burning right now. It's pushing him back so hard he can hardly even reach forward to get the controls. When he does get the controls, he starts piloting it. It's just buffeting him like crazy all over. And the whole time, he's reporting everything back to the ground in his calm pilot voice, giving him his readings of the gauges, telling him what's going on, following the flight plan exactly as it was supposed to have been. On the ground, they hear boom! The first sonic boom that's ever been heard as Yeager breaks the sound barrier. He reaches the top of the apex, and it only had 3 minutes of fuel, right? So it's burned out. He's up at the top. The sky's turned this beautiful deep purple. He can see the stars, the moon. The air is so thin, he's looking almost directly into space. And it's silent. There's no noise. There's nothing to burn. He has 7 minutes of gliding that plane down with no power back for a perfect landing back at the Air Force Base. So I tell you this as a history of the man, something that probably wouldn't happen today, but his importance is just tremendous of of the history of flight. And so as he worked back in the late 40s, other pilots that worked with him saw how calm and cool he sounded on the radio, and they tried to emulate him. And those military pilots he worked with, they became airline pilots. And the other airline pilots with these ex-military guys started saying, wow, these guys sound really good on the air, really calm and cool, and they started talking like that. And pretty soon it spread. And now 65 years later, here we are, hearing every pilot speak in Chuck Yeager's voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.